In today's Commitment 2008 report, the role of the news media in the presidential election.
At the Republican National Convention, there was a lot of talk about the liberal media attacking their party. You may remember that from Vice Presidential candidate Sarah Palin's speech.
I've learned quickly these last few days that if you're not a member in good standing of the Washington elite, then some in the media consider a candidate unqualified for that reason alone. But here's a little news flash for those reporters and commentators. I'm not going to Washington to seek their good opinion. I'm going to Washington to serve the people of this great country.
And she electrified that crowd with those words. All week we've been getting an earful from our viewers who perceive we in the news media as elitist with a liberal tilt. Some people emailed us with our thoughts.
Sampling of your emails, Sharon writes us, the media should be ashamed for doing Obama's dirty work.
This one, Jay from Galt. All this hoopla regarding Palin's daughter is merely a distraction magnified by the liberal media and has no place in this campaign.
Joan Roseville writes us, where is the ethics of the news media that was once a very honorable profession? And attacking the news media is nothing new. Shakespeare took note of bearers of bad news, advising don't shoot the messenger in several of his works. The recent Republican ire with the news media coverage of the vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin is not new either. At the 1964 GOP convention, Barry Goldwater delegates shook their fist at pundits and TV news anchors who they believe were biased and unfair. The GOP has leveraged hostility to the media to their advantage, at one time issuing bumper stickers reading, "Annoy the media, vote Republican." Democrats, too, have lashed out against their media tormentors. 10 years ago, Hillary Clinton blamed a vast right-wing conspiracy while defending her husband during the Monica Lewinsky scandal that then dominated the headlines. Most recently, Senator Clinton complained of media sexism, telling the Washington Post media coverage of the presidential race has been deeply offensive to millions of women. But it was another relatively little-known Republican vice presidential candidate who in 1970 took the most memorable shot. Spiro Agnew, the governor of Maryland, who later resigned in disgrace, became a GOP hero when he said, "In the United States today, we have more than our share of the nattering nabobs of negativism." The news business, he went on to say, was controlled by what he called a tiny and closed fraternity of privileged men elected by no one. And with us tonight is a professor of history at UC Davis, Eric Rauschaway. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
These accusations, as we have noted, have been going on for years, but is it becoming more intense now as we have more media to deal with?
Yeah, these accusations are a result of having a professional media. They go back 100 and some years to when William McKinley really sort of first established a White House press office to try to influence the sort of first version of the modern news. But you're right in thinking they've intensified in the last 40 years or so since Richard Nixon ran his campaign in 1968, which was considerably based around crafting a media image and then critiquing the media.
So what's going on here? What are the dynamics? What is it that works here for Republicans or conservatives by bashing the news media?
What seems to work well for Republicans by bashing the news media is to, as they say, work the refs, to get the media to call it better for them the next time they have to make a call.
The other thing that you can't help but note, certainly in Sarah Palin's speech, very charming. She comes across as very populist. It's us against them, and definitely a way to circle the wagons and rally the troops.
Yeah, there's no question that with Sarah Palin's speech and the convention more generally, the Republican Party has turned against what used to be called John McCain's base, which is to say the media. And they've done that by sort of rallying the activists in the convention hall crowd.
The actual coverage, news coverage, study after study has shown there's actually, when you look at it, a slight conservative tilt. A lot of people might find that surprising.
People do find that surprising. I'm not entirely sure why. I think it's because there's been a deliberate strategy since the Nixon years to portray the press as liberal. But you're right that whenever there's an effort to seriously quantify bias, it usually points out a slightly conservative bias in terminology in the media.
Let's look at the difference between what scientists have actually quantified, which is a slight bias toward the conservative, and how people perceive this. The results of a recent Zombie poll, 83% do believe the media has some sort of a bias. 11% said we are unbiased. Of those who do see a bias, 64% say the media leans to the left, 28% say it leans to the right. And yet, again, when scientists go through and actually try to quantify, and also if you look at talk radio, commentators, that kind of media, again, we do see more of a bias toward the conservative. So why do you think there's this disconnect?
I think if people get told the same thing over and over again for 40 years, they're quite likely to believe it. I think, you mentioned talk radio. Talk radio hosts do tend to lean conservative, and so they reflect that when they comment on how their peers in the press are doing.
And it seems somewhat odd in that the country is described as mostly center-right, and conservatives and Republicans have dominated national politics for nearly 40 years. Yet we still deal with this perception.
Well, it seems to be working. The more you run against the media, the more you seem to get the media to say slightly conservative things, and it seems to help conservatives get elected.
All right, Eric Rashway, a UC Davis professor of history, thank you so much for your time and your analysis, and always interesting for us. We like to be as critical with ourselves and our own industry as everything else we cover, so it's a good conversation to have. Now's the time for you to get in on the conversation. Do you think the media is too conservative, too liberal, or unbiased? Log on to KCRA.com and vote, and feel free to email your opinion.